Alright, let's discuss Emerald Fennel's adaptation of Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, a film that I watched yesterday and have a lot of thoughts about, and most of them are going to be negative. I'm mostly going to be comparing this to the source material and asking the question, is this a good adaptation of Bronte's novel? I'm going to argue, to no one's surprise I imagine, if you're familiar with this channel, that it is a terrible adaptation of the novel, completely misunderstands it, but I will also give some thoughts on it as a film in general. Unfortunately, even there, I didn't think it was that good either, so it's kind of losing on both counts for me. But given the nature of this channel to focus on books, I'm mainly going to be focusing on the topic of how, is this adapting the novel and is it doing a good job? I'll also mainly be focusing on how it interprets the characters, especially the principal four characters of Heathcliff, Catherine, Isabella, and Edgar Linton. I will briefly mention some of the other characters and talk about some more general things, but I really wanted to focus on the characters because I think that is the more interesting part, and also I think that's where the film really fails, is to bring these characters to life and understand them in a way that makes them anything like their companions in the prose. I will begin by giving Fennel some credit though, because she did recognise something that is true of Wuthering Heights, which is that it is a very difficult novel to adapt in a film. She said in a recent article, "It was always going to be either you make a miniseries or do what I've done here and make your own kind of response to the book." And the reason why she has this view is because, quite rightly, the book is a generational story. It begins with Catherine and Heathcliff as children, it goes to them getting older, it then goes into the next generation. It has a framing device which they completely cut from the film, which I do think makes sense more or less. Nevertheless, it's quite a complicated book to, do justice to in the space of, 2.5 hours, whatever it is that films typically allow. And it probably would work better as a miniseries, precisely because then you could have episodes focusing on these different stages and go through them. So I will give Fennel some credit for acknowledging the difficulties of adapting this. However, her point that what she's done here is to make a response to the book. Okay, well, let's just think about what that means. I mean, it's quite an ambiguous statement, really, but in order to respond to the book, you have to be picking up on the book and aspects of that book. And in other interviews, she said that what she's done with this is she's picked up the subtext and brought it all to life somehow. And I have to say that if she found this to be subtext, I'm wondering if she actually read Wuthering Heights, or maybe whether she's read some kind of smut retelling of Wuthering Heights and she mistook it for the original novel, because I see very little justification for any of the choices that she made in this adaptation. Now, Fennel's adaptation is not very original either. Many previous adaptations have told the first half of the story and made it into a rather conventional love story. And really, when it comes down to it, that's what this adaptation of Wuthering Heights is. It's got smatterings of BDSM here and there, and vulgar scenes that are there literally just to be gross and controversial. They add nothing to the plot, really. Most of it is done by side characters who have no bearing on the plot anyway. The film opens with an absolutely disgusting scene of a man getting hung, and it shows you what happens to men downstairs when they get hung for no reason than just to be disgusting, as far as I can tell. Has no bearing on the original text at all. And I think these scenes are just there because ultimately this is a very conventional retelling. It's dressed up with garish aesthetics that are completely inconsistent, both of the time period and within itself. And it includes these sexual scenes just because that's how people will watch the film. And if you removed all those trappings, what you would get is a very conventional class romance, which has been done before many times with these kinds of adaptations. So it's not very original either. The original things don't really work and are there just for shock value, I think. So let's begin with Heathcliff, who is very blandly portrayed, I must say, by Jacob Elordi. Whether or not that's him or the direction, I will let you decide. Nevertheless, I do think this is probably the most bland version of Heathcliff that I have ever seen. I'm not going to bother talking about the much talked about racial casting of Heathcliff, frankly, because I think most people are just hypocrites on that topic. You have people of a more conservative bent banging on about the fact that Edgar is played by a non-white actor and Nelly is, and then you have left-wing people banging on about Heathcliff not being black, and I just don't care because neither side mentions the fact that the film is actually quite blind with the racial casting anyway, so to even address that I think is not really that interesting at this point. And so I'll move on to his characterization outside of that question. Now, Heathcliff is meant to be a force of nature. He is meant to be somewhat mysterious in his origins as well. We never quite know where he comes from. We know that Mr. Earnshaw goes for a walk to Liverpool and comes back. Some people think that Heathcliff is actually a slave child that he picked up there. Others think that Earnshaw had an affair, but none of this stuff is stated, so it's all conjecture. All we know is that Heathcliff is mysterious, and this is a big theme of the book. In many ways, he is wild, a creature of the moors. He's feral. And this means that he's, even from a very young age, he's quite violent and aggressive. He does have his softer moments, but there is something untamed about him. Now, the way the film plays this off, the child actor does have some scenes where he gets angry, but these scenes just to be kind of typical of a young lad, rather than things that show him off to be some kind of dangerous person. He gets frustrated when Kathy tries to teach him how to read. Well, who wouldn't? If you're, if you got someone patronizing you because you can't do something, it's frustrating. And then also him getting upset when his father abuses him and Kathy. Again, pretty reasonable reactions, rather than having someone who right from the off has this unwieldy quality to him. The film also makes Heathcliff's origins more mundane by telling us exactly how he came into Mr. Earnshaw's possession. Mr. Earnshaw, who is played amusingly, but it's kind of bad in terms of who Mr. Earnshaw is in the novel, by Martin Clunes, he's a drunken mess, and he decides to adopt Heathcliff, essentially as a kind of project to make the rough lad into a gentleman. But of course he fails to do this, and really it isn't really shown him doing that much to even try and do this. He seems to just not like Heathcliff pretty quickly anyway. And so that already makes Heathcliff more mundane. We know his origin, we know who he is, and he's just a pretty conventional child who, yes, loses his temper, but what child wouldn't in those circumstances? Things only get worse as Heathcliff gets older. He becomes a rough, man on the farm, working on the farm, and I will say that Elodie is just not strong enough to be Heathcliff. He is too skinny. Heathcliff is meant to be, I think, portrayed by a big guy. He's someone who works on the farm. He's a labourer. He's meant to look dangerous. He's not meant to look pretty. And Elodie is just too pretty to play Heathcliff effectively. He's meant to be a very masculine, wild force of nature. And unfortunately, Elodie is just too effete for that. And it doesn't help that he is directed and characterised in that way as well. Now, obviously, his big moment is when he leaves Catherine after overhearing her say that it would degrade her to marry him. And so he leaves, and then he comes back. And then he starts to put in place his plot of revenge. Now, in the book, this plot of revenge is pretty brutal. He deceives Isabella Linton into marrying him, and he's very abusive to her. He's horrible to her. He's also very horrible to Catherine as well. He's violent and nasty. He also manipulates his brother, Hindley, who is cut from the film. He moves back into Wuthering Heights with Hindley, who has a gambling addiction, and slowly he makes Hindley gamble away all his money and eventually the deed to Wuthering Heights. So all of these things show you how brutal and horrible Heathcliff is. In the film adaptation, he returns to Wuthering Heights and just buys it and allows his dad to live there. So already he's not really being shown to be that much of a bad person. In fact, he could have kicked his dad out, but he didn't. He just lets him live there. And actually, his dad continues to be mean to him. So it's not even clear that he's doing anything wrong in that case. Likewise, with the Isabella storyline, there's some inclination that that's going to happen, that he's going to deceive her in that way, but then him and Catherine start hooking up again, so it's fine. And then when he eventually does betray Catherine in this way, he goes into Isabella's room, tells her to her face how horrible and nasty he's going to be to her, tells her that he doesn't love her. Does she still want to be with him? For some reason, she says yes. We'll come to Isabella later. That was a travesty, is all I'll say for now. And so she goes with Heathcliff to the house, and she's complicit then in everything that follows. And so Heathcliff actually does not come across all that bad in the story, because he's been softened, and all of those moments, those spiky moments of anger and rage that you get in the book, right from when he's a boy to when he's an adult, are just completely missing. Most of the time his anger's somewhat justified, even if he's a bit odd. It's not like he's that much of a dangerous figure. It's almost laughable then that the film decides to keep Catherine's speech to Isabella from the book. Isabella finds herself attracted to Heathcliff because he comes across to her as being a gentleman, and maybe a little bit dark and mysterious, but ultimately a good person. And Catherine laughs at Isabella for this. She says, you completely misunderstand him if you think that that's who he is. He's not. You have this romantic notion of a Byronic hero. He's a monster. Now, they keep this in the film. I don't know why, because there's no indication that Heathcliff is really that bad. In fact, I'd say Catherine comes across much worse than he does. And so it's sort of laughable that the film has this, because it actually doesn't make sense, because the film doesn't want to portray Elodie too badly, Heathcliff too badly. And the reason for that is it wants the audience, the sensitive modern audience, to like him. And in order to like him, you can't have him going too far over the edge, because then you probably won't like him. Most people who read Wuthering Heights don't like Heathcliff. A lot of people hate him and despise him. They might like him as a character, but as a person, they find him quite repugnant. And that is intentional, because a big theme of Wuthering Heights is don't romanticize these kinds of men. They're not to be romanticized. And that is actually what Catherine's speech is about. The irony of Fennel's adaptation is that as much as she's horrible to Isabella as someone who is foolish enough to romanticize Heathcliff, this film is an exercise in that romanticization. The Heathcliff that we get on the screen is actually how Isabella sees Heathcliff, more or less, I would say, in the book. So it's ironic, really, that Fennel is so down on Isabella, because actually her perspective of Heathcliff is Isabella's perspective, which also makes it kind of funny, given what she does to Isabella. Perhaps, she's projecting her life right onto that character and doesn't even know it. So overall, I just found Heathcliff to be dull. It was just lots of hunching over Cathy, going, "I love you, Cathy. I love you, love. Oh, yeah," in a northern accent, which just sounded stupid to me. I didn't find it remotely romantic. I just thought it was dumb. And the even funnier one was when they were making love. Well, not really making love. I'm not sure I'd call it that. And he was basically, speaking in this low, gravelly northern voice, saying, "I'll kill Edgar. I'll tear him apart. Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah," as he's, doing his business. And I just laughed. I was laughing at that scene. I didn't find it remotely scary. It didn't show Heathcliff to be unhinged. It was just cringe-inducing, as was a lot of this film, and didn't show Heathcliff to be anything, because he didn't actually live up to that promise. Now, if he'd have gone into Edgar's room and tore his throat out, that would be, well, it probably wouldn't be quite in keeping with the book, but it would be closer to the book if he was to do something like that. But again, the film doesn't actually want Heathcliff to ever go over the edge. It always brings him back in some small way. He gets angry, but then he restrains himself. He gets revenge with Isabella, but he tells her what he's doing, so it's not really all that bad compared to the manipulation he does in the book. And so that's the sense in which Heathcliff is very much neutered in this adaptation, to the point where by the end of it, I genuinely was tired and just was hoping the thing would end, because he was that bland an interpretation. Moving on then to Catherine. Now, I think that Catherine was done the best in terms of understanding of the text, because she was portrayed to be quite haughty and erratic in her behaviour. I think that came across actually very well. I had no issues with that in a very, very general sense. However, I think that the kind of haughtiness that Catherine has was... Catherine in the film adaptation was essentially portrayed how Cathy appears after she marries Edgar Linton in the book. There are two dimensions to Cathy's personality. There is Cathy before she meets the Lintons, when she's much more closer to Heathcliff. She's not meant to be Hermione Granger, which is how she comes across as the child, and even to some degree as an adult. She comes across as too intelligent, too mannered right from the off. She's meant to be somewhat feral. She's been neglected in the book by Hindley, because her dad dies in the book quite early, and he just sort of lets them do whatever. He's very abusive to Heathcliff. He's more just neglectful of Cathy, and so they basically are raised by the wilds. They live out on the moors, doing their crazy games. And so the early Cathy should be closer to Heathcliff. She shouldn't be this highly educated, haughty Hermione Granger archetype. She should be closer to him. Then when she goes to the Grange in the book, which happens when they're both children, she's then introduced to this world, to this civilizing world of the Lintons, where people are kind, where people are loving. And then she changes, and when she gets married, that's when she becomes this more haughty kind of volatility that she is in the film. And I think that that's what should have happened. We should have seen that transition with Cathy's character. I also will say that the Catherine in the film didn't quite reach the heights of Cathy in the book. In the book, Cathy actually physically assaults Edgar before she even marries him, and it almost ruins her marriage prospects, which they completely cut from the film. She also pinches Nellie at one point. She's a very violent person. I think there's one scene where she's like cry-slapping Heathcliff, which again was just cringy and conventional. Like, yes, woman crying, slaps husband. I think it was in the rain as well, just to really amp up the cliche of it all. And he's like, oh, Kathy, I still love you, all that crap. It's romantic, sentimental nonsense. Whereas the Kathy in the book, if she was angry with someone, she could be brutal. She could be violent, aggressive. And so she had a much higher end of volatility. So even though I think the book does gets it somewhat right, they don't let her really tip over the edge. So she's still fundamentally drawn back. And the worst element of this is that in the book, Catherine really plays up her crying herself to death. She has these hysterical fits and she becomes ill a few times from this. In the film, they do have moments where she says things like, I'm gonna die, but it's portrayed comically every time. And it doesn't really come across like a woman who actually makes herself ill through becoming hysterical, which is what the Kathy in the book is like. And so when we get to the later part of the film where Nellie doesn't believe her and thinks she's just being hysterical, it just doesn't come across very well. It doesn't come across as believable because they didn't play that up enough for us to actually believe that Nellie would make that mistake, which makes her look out to be a real villain of the piece rather than maybe just a misguided, slightly judgmental maid, which is what she is in the books. But the thing that I think is the worst aspect of how Catherine develops in the film is that, once again, and to not really my surprise, is that the film takes a bog-standard feminist interpretation of Wuthering Heights, where Catherine's decision to marry Edgar, is reduced to just another class romance. So a lot is made of this line that she says that it would degrade her to marry Heathcliff. And the standard feminist interpretation of that is what she's saying there, and in that whole scene, is that she can't marry Heathcliff because he's poor and they'd be outcast, so she has to marry Edgar. It's all just to do with the poor victimization of women in that time period. Like, I'm falling asleep already, just providing this interpretation. Now, the reason why I say that is because, actually, if you look at the novel properly, you can see that there's actually a lot more going on with Catherine than that. Catherine's whole story arc is one where she begins with Heathcliff, she then moves in with the Lintons for a while, and for the first time, she's in an environment where she's the favourite. Because in her family, her dad likes her, but she's a bit too naughty. So, he's a bit hostile towards her. Not abusive, but just a bit hostile. And he favours Heathcliff. When the dad dies and Hindley's there, he's neglecting her. She meets the Earnshaws and they're really nice. And so she's finally the favourite. She's finally taken care of. Not only that, but they educate her. And the Grange is a very beautiful place, unlike Wuthering Heights, which is somewhat scary, gothic, and full of violence. And so it's not so much a class thing as it is she's actually introduced to a loving world where she's treated quite well. She's spoiled, which appeals to her vanity because she is a vain character. And so that is what tempts her, I would argue, way more than this boring, overdone feminist point about class consciousness, because that really doesn't come up all that much in the book. And I would say that actually when she says that it would degrade her to marry Heathcliff, that maybe to some degree she's being sincere. She's recognised that she has moved up in social station and that Heathcliff is still stuck down there. So, interpreting that just as a point about class, class consciousness, I think isn't quite right. I think there's a lot more going on in that passage and that Catherine's motivations are a lot more complex. I think she's a vain person and the Lintons flatter her vanity, whereas Heathcliff doesn't. He sees her exactly how she is. And so he knows that as much as she might put on the fancy dresses and the perfume, he knows what's underneath. And I think her going towards Lintons is more about that than it is, I just need to marry someone and have some money and status. And the film really pushes this narrative by having Edgar just be played by a rather plain-looking, middle-aged man. I don't know what the reason for that was other than just, well, if he just looks boring and is boring, then there's no other reason that you can provide. Because in the book, Edgar is portrayed as quite handsome. He's pretty, he's everything that Heathcliff isn't. And so it's important to have that contrast visually because it allows you to contrast not just the two male characters, but also Catherine's conflict between the wild, rugged Heathcliff and the sort of pretty, wealthy and comfortable Lintons. You also should get this through the way that these scenes are portrayed as well. And unfortunately, the way that the mansion is portrayed, the Grange, it isn't really that pretty either. It's got this very stylized, horrible vibe to it that makes it come across as like a gothic castle in itself. So that whole comparison between civilization and nature just goes completely out of the window and just doesn't work. So despite all of its vulgarity with the sexual content, actually the romance between Catherine and Heathcliff is pretty conventional, pretty boring, and I do, like I said earlier, I wonder if a lot of that stuff was just included as window dressing, because otherwise people may have actually fallen asleep, because both of these characters are incredibly muted when compared to the source material, where they're much more complex characters, much more alive and volatile and crazy than anything we see on screen with them. So let's move on to Edgar and Isabella. And I will actually give credit to the actors, because I actually think that they did great with the measly roles they were given. And I actually feel sorry for the actor who played Edgar, because what a thankless job that must have been. In the novel, Edgar is, he's a character that I don't necessarily like, because I think that he is quite judgmental and horrible and cruel, but he's just more civilized with it, and so maybe he gets away with it. Although he does have his endearing moments too. Nevertheless, everything that makes Edgar interesting in the novel is completely stripped away in this adaptation. Edgar basically does nothing as a character. He arrives on the scene in order to tempt Cathy with wealth, because that's the only motivation that she has, and she marries him. He then is basically just a useless cuckold, completely unaware of Catherine's attraction to Heathcliff. In the book, Edgar knows what them two are like. He meets Heathcliff before he marries Catherine. He sees how violent and horrible he is, and when he comes back, he's not happy about it. He doesn't really want Heathcliff around, but he doesn't immediately say that she can't. It's only when he sees Heathcliff having designs on Isabella, when he steps in and says, "Stay the hell away from my sister," that he then ousts Heathcliff, if I'm remembering right, which I think I am. And then that leads into Edgar, when Isabella runs away with Heathcliff, rejecting his sister in one of his cruelest moments, especially when she sends these letters describing her abuse, and he's just like, it's her own fault, she's made her bed. And so the novel Edgar is actually quite an interesting character. He begins as this soft gentleman. I think we see him crying in the first scene as a perfect contrast. He's inside the Grange with his sister crying, while Heathcliff and Cathy are out in the rain being feral. And then he grows into this man who's affectionate and kind towards Cathy, and then he becomes a long-suffering husband to Cathy, and then he becomes, uses his power as a husband to say Heathcliff is gone, he's staying away, and that leads to Catherine becoming crazy and eventually dying. The problem with Edgar then in the film is that he's just not much of a character. He doesn't do much. He's just a plot device in order to cause tension between Catherine and Heathcliff. It also makes Edgar's reactions to things pretty reasonable. I don't really dislike the Edgar in the film. I feel sorry for him. He married a woman who cheats on him, and when he stands up for himself and says, "Stay away from, you're staying away from him," I have no objections to that. If my partner was having an affair, I'd say, "You stay away from that person. I'm not having them around in my house anymore." So the Edgar in the film is actually one of the most likable characters, although he's not much of a character, because there's not much characterization really in him, because the film doesn't really care about him all that much. And now we move on to Isabella, who, her role isn't as thankless as Edgar's, because she is given some characterization. It's just that the characterization is probably one of the most mean-spirited interpretations of a literary character I've ever come across. Actually, no, there are probably some others, but it's up there. It's certainly up there. And the reason for that is that the book Isabella is also meant to be a very beautiful woman. She's meant to be a kind person. She's meant to fall in love with Heathcliff and see this romantic hero in him. And so, yeah, she's a bit naive in that sense. But then the tragedy of Isabella is she marries him. She's horribly abused by him. There's one of the best bits in the book is when there's a violent confrontation with Heathcliff, where she finally is able to leave and flee with her child. Maybe she hasn't had the child yet. She might still be pregnant at that point. Nevertheless, she flees in one of the best scenes in the book, which is cut from the film. And and then she becomes a much stronger character as well. The Isabella that we get in the film is, first of all, she's not the sister of Edgar, but she's his ward, which is a bizarre choice. And she is portrayed as a not very attractive, sort of Arrested Development kind of romantic who still plays with dolls and is a little bit creepy. A lot of her scenes evoked laughs from the audience, including me, because it was so absurd. And I did enjoy the actress. I thought she did a good job with what she had. Nevertheless, it was a very mean-spirited interpretation, because basically what Fennel was doing there was she was noting in the book Isabella is naive. But rather than just have her being a normal woman who can fall prey to a charming man, she decided to make her an absolute fool at first, in having her as this sort of, grown-up child. And then, when Heathcliff comes into her room and says, I'll never love you. I'll hate you forever. I'll treat you terribly. Do you still want me? And she's like, yes, I do. And then she goes with him. They sort of portray it as her being into some weird kink stuff. And so then there's a scene later where Nellie goes to the house to get her back, and she's there acting like a dog or a puppy or whatever, and she likes it. And it's just like, what is this weird nonsense? I mean, also, like, what a weird representation of a kinkster in the first place, because it's not like people into BDSM actually want someone who doesn't love them, right? They might like to play games where someone treats them like a dog or whatever, but they're games. It's not actually sincere. If it was sincere, that would be a genuine problem. Like if someone actually wanted to be abused and to be hated by the person they lived with, rather than play acting those things, we would probably want that person to seek help. And so it was very bizarre, because on the one hand, she's portrayed as this innocent nothing, romantic, idealized nonsense, and then she becomes this like weird fetish freak. And it was just awful. It was so cringy, the dog scene. I just thought it was ridiculous. And again, it ruined Heathcliff's as a character, because he is supposed to be convincing this woman deceptively. He's supposed to be deceiving her. But if he's just telling her everything and she agrees to it, then in what sense is he doing anything wrong? It's certainly weird, but it's not necessarily wrong. I would say also it's just not very believable as a scene. The idea that someone would walk into your room, say all that, and you'd be like, yeah, let's get hitched. Get a grip. It's just nonsense. Absolute nonsense. And it's really this that makes me think, Fennel is just completely off her rocker when she says she's responding to the text. Because there is nothing in the text to imply that Isabella is like that at all. There is nothing in the text remotely anything to do with that. She's naive and she makes a mistake. And then she suffers for it, and she suffers terribly for it. So I don't know what Fennel was doing there, aside from just wanting to subvert and shock to get people watching. Because again, remove those scenes, and there's really not that much of an interesting film left behind. So that's everything about our principal characters. I do want to briefly talk about Mr. Earnshaw and Nellie, and very briefly Joseph. It was odd to me that Joseph was even in this film, because he bore no resemblance at all to the Joseph of the book. The Joseph of the book is a horrible, Bible-thumping bigot who is horribly abusive to Heathcliff and to Kathy. In this film, he appears as basically just a random guy who has another vulgar scene that plays no part in the actual story. It's just there to be vulgar. And then he's sort of portrayed sympathetically a bit later, but then also as a pervert again. Literally goes nowhere. Don't know why he's there. Don't even know why he's called Joseph. Could have called him anything, for all he bears resemblance to his novel counterpart. Mr. Earnshaw is more interesting. He is essentially Mr. Earnshaw combined with Hindley, which is a combination that makes no sense. When you combine characters, usually what you do is you combine characters who play similar functional roles, because if they're doing a similar thing, then they may as well just do the same thing. But the whole point about Mr. Earnshaw is he genuinely loves and cares for Heathcliff, and it is his favouritism that leads Hindley to reject Heathcliff and hate him, which is one of the big things, the driving things for Heathcliff's abuse at the hands of Hindley, and then Heathcliff's revenge on Hindley, which again leads to some of the most dramatic and interesting parts of the story. Instead, Mr. Earnshaw is portrayed in typical feminist fashion as your run-of-the-mill patriarchal dad. He even has an annoying bit of dialogue where he's like, bloody women, and it's just played for laughs, and it was kind of funny because of the actor. But the point is, by doing that, by having him be a buffoon, it's even mentioned at one point that he, craps his pants when he gets drunk. It's like, you can't take him seriously as an abusive figure when he's been constantly ridiculed by the story. And even when he dies, Catherine kicks his face in and his teeth come falling out. It's just one big patriarchal joke. And it really dampens those early scenes, because it dampens that figure as someone who is genuinely threatening and evil. When you have Hindley in the novel pulling a knife on Nellie, I think it's Nellie, and shoving it in between her teeth, that's brutal, that's violent, that's scary. You don't get anything like that really from Mr. Earnshaw. He does have his moments of domestic violence, but they're all just pretty run-of-the-mill and don't really go all that far in the way that the novel does. Ultimately, he's just not a very good character. He's a bit of Hindley and a bit of this feminist, parody of a patriarchal man, and it just doesn't work fundamentally. And so I do think that getting rid of Hindley was a bad idea for this adaptation. I think he should have been there, because he provides a lot of the dramatic tension for the first half of the novel, and Mr. Earnshaw, the replacement Hindley, doesn't really do that at all. And there's not much to say about Nellie because she's pretty much a background character. It makes sense somewhat that she's more background than she's in the book, because although she's the narrator of the story, she is very much an observer character, but she does have more of a role to play in the story than she's given here. They pretend that she has some kind of noble backstory and that she's here sort of on hard times, but don't really do anything with it, doesn't really go anywhere. I just really didn't find much to that, so I have very little to say. They obviously played with the idea that Nellie is complicit in some of the tragedy that happens, but again, they didn't really do all that much with that either. And I just thought that the character was just dealt with in a very bland way, similar to Edgar, where she was there when she needed to be there for the plot, but didn't really feel like a fully realized character with motivations and an integral part of the story. So that's everything I want to say about this adaptation. I think ultimately it failed as a response to Wuthering Heights because I'm not sure that Fennel actually read Wuthering Heights. As I said earlier, I think she read a sexy fanfic of Wuthering Heights and mistook that for the original novel, because none of the characters really bear much resemblance to their novel counterparts. I think the story ultimately is just a very conventional retelling of Wuthering Heights as a class romance, which has been done before, and like I've said many times now, but you strip away all of the saucy scenes, and that really is all that is left. Heathcliff is dull, Kathy is dull, and I have to say, last 20 minutes of the film, I was almost falling asleep. I was that bored. So I don't think it worked very well as a film in its own right either, although I'll leave that for the film critics to discuss amongst themselves. But let me know down in the comments if you've seen this adaptation, what did you think of it? I look forward to discussing that with you in the comments below. Otherwise, take care everyone. Ta-ra.